rather than keeping us in awkward silence, I'll start today's second webinar as part of the FCFC Career Development series. Hello, everyone. So what is the FCFC? The Future Counter Fraud community brings together professionals, educational institutions, and subject matter experts to support those aspiring a career in counter fraud. And in terms of this session, these webinars are part of a series to provide new and potential members of the counter fraud professionals community more information to support them through their careers. And this session is specifically aimed at those interested in a career in counter fraud in the context of climate change and sustainability and driving change. You'll see that this session is being recorded. We also have a Q&A box, which Hope is monitoring. So do put in your questions and we'll deal with those as and when we can. And obviously, if you want more information about the FCFC, do go to the Fraud Advisory Panel, and I'm sure Hope can put the email address or the web address in the Q&A box if you need. If I could start with introducing myself and introducing our eminent speakers. So I've the pleasure of chairing the session. I'm Maria Cronin. I'm a partner in the business crime team at Peters & Peters, a specialist firm in litigation, both criminal and civil, in the fraud space. And I'm also have the pleasure of being a trustee of the Fraud Advisory Panel. Rebecca Wade is the head of counter fraud for Ofgem, specifically focusing on preventing and detecting and recovering fraud within the social and environmental energy schemes that Ofgem administer on behalf of the government. With a career solely in public sector fraud, Rebecca joined the civil service as a graduate and has worked within several government organisations, including HMRC and the Public Sector Fraud Authority. We have Laura Middleton, who is a director in PwC's Forensic Services team based in Manchester. As part of her role, she leads the ESG investigations team, who conduct investigations into greenwashing and environmental law. Laura joined PwC as a graduate, working across the audit and forensic services practices. And we will be trying to delve into the world of eco-fraud. So, to start, we probably should deal with a few definitions, and we'll be using a number of definitions throughout. Firstly, we'll be talking about ESG as well as eco-fraud. So what is ESG? Stands for environmental, social, governance. It's the three main pillars by which companies have engaged in environmental sustainability and social responsibility. What is eco-fraud? Slightly more difficult, although difficult to imagine anything more difficult than ESG. It is environmental eco-fraud is a broad church. It can include misrepresentations about green sustainability credentials, also known as greenwashing, misreporting of sustainability data, whether in financial reporting or to external agencies, such as the government, investors, or ESG rating agencies, misdeclarations of waste compliance, falsification of environmental reports or certifications, your standard scamming of individuals into non-existent green schemes, or perhaps simply overinflating the green credentials of those schemes. So why is it challenging? And when it comes to defining eco-fraud, well, it's more than just conventional fraud in an environmental context. All these eco-frauds vary in terms of the nature of the frauds and also the way in which they will be enforced. And I think that's probably best demonstrated by the variety of agencies and enforcement bodies that deal with eco-frauds as opposed to standard frauds. But perhaps we can turn to what the current landscape looks like and which agencies are operating in these in the current landscape. And Rebecca, if I can start on those that I see, and perhaps you could input on where you see the current eco fraud space. So in terms of the landscape as I see it, so to date in the UK, the Advertising Standards Agency and the Competition and Markets Authority have really led the regulatory charge to tackle greenwashing cases. And you've had recent announcements last year that the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, have been investigating Unilever in respect of a number of its brands. The ASA, the Advertising Standards Agency, made a recent finding against Virgin in respect of its sustainability adverts. In terms of the Environment Agency and other agencies such as Ofwat and Ofgem, of which Rebecca will know far more, they've been leading the charge in terms of environmental cases. So we can deal with examples of those perhaps later on. The Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, has this year introduced new anti-greenwashing rules and finalised guidance to protect customers from misleading sustainability claims. It also announced this year that it's investigating its first climate-related case. And then also you still have the Serious Fraud Office and the Financial Conduct Authority investigating boiler room type frauds, including eco frauds. And that's not to list the agencies that look into the money laundering aspects of eco frauds, which I won't list. It will take too long. But if anyone's interested in that, we can also tackle that. But perhaps, Rebecca, you can give your insights as to where you see the current landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Maria. I think for us, it's quite different because, as mentioned, my focus or Ofgem kind of delivery and schemes focus is a lot more around stopping fraud within the schemes that we administer to try and reach net zero. So what we administer a lot of schemes through third parties such as energy suppliers. So we rely on those guys a lot, and we're doing a lot of upskilling in that space. And they are responding to that kind of understanding of fraud and working with regulators to make sure that we are not allowing fraud to happen, but also not allowing that consumer harm to happen. Also in that space, you've got other kind of bodies that administer accreditations for people that work in this sector. So people like Trustmark or MCS, who administer kind of the accreditations, the certification to say that the technology that we're using is legit and is what we're saying it is, and is moving towards that net zero. They all have a big part to play in making sure these frauds are being stopped. And then there are a few that kind of you've mentioned, Maria, that work across the piece. So trading standards, I think, is quite a big one. We see a lot of people trying to impersonate Ofgem and come in and do things. So we work quite closely with those guys. And it's likely that people that are committing fraud in this space against a government organisation like us are probably doing it with other organisations and in that arena. So things like the National Anti-Fraud Network and those sort of organisations that try and bring all that intelligence together really help with the landscape of this kind of fraud and building that bigger picture on who's doing what and whether we're actually working towards net zero in a sustainable way.
Thank you. And do we see, I think both Rebecca and Laura, do we see the risks as being the same when it comes to grants in and from the public third sector? You seeing more emphasis on that, or is it broader?
I mean, I'll let Laura come in a second, but I think broadly the risks are the same. So I think a lot of it is around kind of that falsification of what technology is being used, of what's there, that misrepresentation of actually what's in place, and whether we are whether the measures are doing what they say they're doing to reach that net zero goal. I think that's the biggest kind of thing we see in the government grant space. Obviously, there's naturally the falsification of eligibility, but that misrepresentation is really key. Laura, I don't know if you had any perspective from your work.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely agree. It is mostly about that falsification. I guess one area we've seen in some of our work as well. Which is not the case for all government grants that are focused on net zero, but when you're looking at housing stock, there's a lot of reliance on EPC certificates to identify which homes are eligible and therefore which homes need the measures. There's a lot of potential fraud and unreliability in that information. So you have examples where properties are already at a fairly decent level, but are shown in the EPC certificate not to be. They get the measures. It's not that the measures then don't exist. It's just that they're not targeting the right properties and having the impact that they should do. So that's one of the real challenges there for some of the work that I do.
Thank you. So I think we have a better idea of the kind of eco-fraud landscape, which is incredibly varied, as we've seen from those examples. What do we think the evolution of these threats may look like going forward? Laura, have you got any views?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess threat-wise, I think we've got a few areas that I draw out as being probably going to be increasingly important. Not that they aren't already, but we're probably going to see more of. So number one for me is around sustainability reporting. So a lot of my work before I started operating in the ESG space was very much focused on financial fraud and organizations that are misreporting things in their financial statements. Regulations like CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is an EU rule but affects a lot of UK companies, that's requiring them to put a lot more on paper to say what they're doing to address a lot of environmental concerns and social and governance. And that creates the same sort of driver of potential fraudulent reporting as some of the financial reporting in the past. So I think we're probably going to see more of that. I suspect it's going to take a little while for that to hit, because certainly my experience is everyone's finding their way at the moment. There's a lot of greyness in terms of how things are defined. So, I mean, you can take that either way, but there might be a little bit more difficulty in interpreting whether something is genuinely fraud and there was intent behind it, or it's just poor quality data. The other area I'd draw out as an emerging issue, and there have been examples of it over the past few years, is around carbon credits. Vast majority of companies have some kind of reference to carbon credits in their net zero plans. There's broader doubts about the science behind those that I'm not going to get into, definitely not my area of technical expertise, but we also know a lot of those schemes do have issues with fraud and corruption, and I think we might see some of that coming down the track, both in terms of companies themselves thinking, I've not bought something that I can actually rely on, it's not achieving what it should do, potentially even mis-selling claims in that space, but then also people looking at companies' net zero statements and say, well, actually, you've not done what you said you were going to do as a company. You've not contributed towards net zero because you're just relying on these credits that actually don't have any worth. So I think that's going to play out a bit more in coming years as well, especially as we get closer to 2030, when the first companies are really starting to hit their net zero targets, or try to hit their net zero targets, I should say.
Rebecca.
Yeah, I think I'm going to lead back to that comment Laura made in the last thing about the EPC certificates and those being falsified. I mean, as we've seen some of our schemes go on, we have upgraded a lot more houses, we've made them a lot more energy efficient. So that kind of space where the eligible houses are narrows, and there are a lot fewer houses as the schemes go on. So I think we're going to see a lot more kind of fraud and manipulation in that space, but also something that we're seeing as the tech gets more mainstream and people are more aware of what it looks like, what it does. We're already seeing kind of imitation tech being used in the market and in that space, and we just don't know if that is as energy efficient as kind of what we're expecting. So the fraud in that space and the misrepresentation, kind of like the PPE stuff for COVID, it might not be doing what it says and what we're expecting within the regs. And I think just one more point on kind of the evolution of these threats, but also the evolution of how we identify the fraud in this space is going to get increasingly difficult. We're already seeing the use of AI and tech to kind of hide falsified documents, eligibility criteria, those kind of things is already getting increasingly sophisticated, and we're going to have to keep up with that to be able to spot these threats and make sure actually we are having the impact that we think we're having.
Thank you. And what do you both feel about the current legislation? I know, Laura, you mentioned some of the EU legislation. Do we think, and obviously there is a failure to prevent fraud offence that will no doubt play a role, but do we think in terms of legislation that it is sufficient to address the current risks and threats that we foresee?
I think it's going to have to evolve in the same way that the way we detect and prevent fraud is going to have to evolve. The legislation is going to need to shift over time. I guess one example of that changing is, you mentioned the Competition and Market Authority. They've got their Green Claims Code. That's what Unilever is being investigated under. Generally, in the past, as an outcome from their investigations, it's been undertakings, so requiring companies to put certain measures in place, and sure, they get measured on that and it does drive change. There's a new act that I'm going to get the acronym wrong for, DMCC, Digital Markets. I can't remember what the other two C's stand for off the top of my head, but that actually introduces, it gives them the ability to fine organisations, and it's a relatively sizable fine, and sometimes that's what's needed to really drive behaviours home. I think the other bit that I'll be interested to see how it evolves is some of the other regulators you mentioned. So people like the Serious Fraud Office and maybe over in the US, the DOJ, not necessarily looking at greenwashing as a standalone piece, but whether that gets more woven into their investigations. So when they're looking at bribery and corruption, for example, are they looking at that green angle as well as the more standard elements of corruption? That might be a way that it evolves. It just becomes business as usual and embedded in some of the broader rules and regulations that are set up to manage fraud.
I think that's absolutely right. I think in terms of supply chain risks, I think we will see perhaps a development similar to the Bribery Act in terms of putting the onus perhaps on the company, but looking at the risk within the whole of their network, the whole of their supply chain, and looking at what is being done to address those risks. Firstly, to identify them and then address them. Rebecca, you were going to come in, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's just to say that I'm quite excited to see how the Failure to Prevent Fraud Act plays out in practice. I think we really need to move into this space where it's not acceptable to not be looking for these things and to not have the processes in place to stop fraud from happening, whether it's against the consumer, against the organization, or against the environment. Like, these things all play a part. And it would be really interesting to see kind of what part that plays in holding people to account a bit more, so that fraud isn't just seen as a part of doing business, or we're just going to lose money to fraud. It really is, okay, we have to take this seriously and put something in place to stop fraud from happening.
Do either of you have a feel for whether one particular enforcement agency is going to take the lead on that? Because obviously we've mentioned quite a few, and UK fraud is covers a very wide remit.
To be fair, it's not something I'd really thought about. I guess it's quite difficult to see exactly where it would sit with all the different moving parts that are to play in this, and the different aspects. I mean, we've spoken about how eco fraud and green fraud are very wide terms. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out, Maria. Probably not the answer you were looking for there, but maybe Laura has the answer to all of the questions.
I don't have the answer.
No, I'm a similar position for me. I think because it touches on so many different things, and if you take your advertising standards agency, they're going to be looking at something entirely different to what the Serious Fraud Office would be looking for. There could be crossovers, but I don't think you're ever going to get to a position where you've got one agency with sole responsibility for eco fraud. And then when you get into ESG, that's even worse, because it's even broader as a definition and pretty much encompasses almost any type of fraud, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a very unfair question, but I thought I'd try and tease out whether or not anyone else has the answers. So, I mean, obviously, we've touched on some the areas that the landscape we've touched on, where we see them evolving. We've looked at why, the direction of travel that we see. why is it important? I can ask Rebecca.
Yeah, I think fraud, people don't realize fraud kind of has an impact on various different aspects of everyone's lives. So if you take, for example, fraud against Ofgem schemes, whether they are grant schemes, which are taxpayers' money, or they are run through, administered through energy suppliers, it will affect us all in that way. So whether it's through us not having enough money to put into other public services, or it gets put onto our energy bills, it plays a massive part in everyone's day-to-day lives. Just a little bit of fraud here and there can put that cost of living prices even further. And we know that it kind of disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable in our society. So those that need those public services, those that are already struggling to pay their energy bills. But I guess there's like wider impacts than just the financial and just kind of the impact on the consumer. So the reputational risk, particularly for government, for our schemes not being used in the way they're meant to, or even if we see large companies greenwashing, that has a massive reputational risk for those companies, but also then on society and social change. So if I see a large company lying and greenwashing, does that make it much harder to convince me that I should be doing these little things that are going to help the environment? Absolutely. And once that trust is broken, it's really difficult to build it back up. It can be broken really quickly, and then we'll have to spend years, particularly kind of trusting government and on these schemes. Really, really difficult, and it might make people lose faith in the technology that we're trying to implement to get to net zero. I mean, we've already touched on kind of the wider environmental impact of it as well. I don't think people realise enough that all of these things really do damage our impacts that we're having against net zero. And if we can't accurately say, oh, this is where we're at and this is where we're going to get to, that makes it a lot harder. There's also, I guess, like if without all of those things, the consumer harm aspect and the physical safety, particularly in the space of gas and electric, if we see fraud on our schemes, they can have massive impacts on physical safety if we're not putting the right technology in, if we're putting ineligible or faulty technology in that's not meeting our regulations. There for a reason that could have wide impacts on the consumer and kind of their lives. And we've already seen that in some instances where people are imitating or they're fraudulently obtaining kind of their accreditation. The measures they're installing in homes have left people with like wide scale illnesses from mold and damp and things not being insulated properly. So I think there's various different impacts of fraud past the financial, which is really why we should all be standing up and taking account of this. I don't know, Laura, if you had things to add on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, really well said, and agree with absolutely all of that. I think there's probably two of the bits I'd add that we see. First, really linked to the last point you made, and it's that connection between the eco fraud and that wider corruption. And quite often when we're looking at ESG as a whole, you see issues with the E and it impacts the S. So if I go back to those carbon credit schemes I talked about, and some of them are reforestation or preserving forests in areas in other countries, none of the money that's going into that is then benefiting those communities and helping them to improve their lives. So there's that link, or we've obviously got the broader issue that's not addressing net zero, but it's also impacting those communities, and that money is not going where people think it should. It's going into fraudsters' pockets. And then I suppose the other piece, and it's almost the converse, or it's the impact of greenwashing. We are seeing on the corporate side more concerns from companies about being accused of greenwashing, and so they're very much limiting what they say in their annual statements on their websites to the absolute minimum that they need to say, so that they don't fall foul of these of any of these rules. And that might not sound like too much of an issue, but it draws attention away from the issue, and it reduces transparency. So consumers, you can't decide which product do I want to buy, which one's going to make the biggest difference. So whilst that's not fraud per se, it's an impact of the fraud in a slightly a slightly disconnected way, but we are really starting to see more of that flow through as well, and it's a real concern for a lot of companies who are trying to do the right thing but maybe have some slightly woolly or unreliable information versus the genuine fraudsters.
And I suppose this is not really on our in our remit, but also that I think, Rebecca, you mentioned, and Laura also, that the science has moved on quite significantly in terms of our understanding of actually what claims can now be substantiated, and the scientific evidence to support that substantiation is also evolving. So I suppose it's also trying to keep up with their understanding of what can be said when we know that the science is evolving as well. We had a comment in the Q&A from Joshua Dom, who mentions a very good point about civic society that are also now policing these things. And he gives the example of Lululemon investigation, which was a complaint made, I think, to the regulator, and has become a multi-jurisdictional investigation against Lululemon in a number of jurisdictions. And I think we will probably see more of that type of investigation, which spans not just one jurisdiction, but multiple jurisdictions, similar to the point, Laura, that you've made about the fact you can't disassociate the E from the S. You also can't disassociate the kind of multiple jurisdictions where you might be having a supply in one jurisdiction, claims made in another, and an investigation starting in protecting one or a number. I don't know if either of you have a view as to where you see that evolving.
I guess I can give my perspective on some of the reporting standards in particular, and do have a very confusing diagram that has all of the different standards and the slight differences between all of them. And I think certainly from speaking to my class, it's incredibly confusing and keeping a lot of people busy trying to work out which apply in which different scenario for which different entities. I hope it will all start to move together and there'll be greater clarity on so you get that read across between jurisdictions, but I think we're a little while off. And if I take the accounting standards, and I suppose a lot of people on this call probably be accountants by background, those have been developing for over 100 years. We've only had ESG standards, ESG reporting standards for a couple of years, so there's a long way to go before we get to that same level of sophistication. But yeah, the cross-jurisdictional investigations and reporting are particularly challenging, I think.
Thank you. And I suppose there's a lot more we can touch upon, but perhaps we could turn to how we've come to eco-fraud and how we have developed specialisms in this area. Could you share, Laura, perhaps your experience of where you started and how you came to ESG? I'm going to use ESG rather than just eco-fraud.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love to say it was by design, but not necessarily, but found my way into something that I love. So I joined PwC where I work after I graduated. I selected at the time, we had a scheme where we did a mixture of normal audit and forensic services. I chose that because my degree was actually in sciences. So my degree is in epidemiology, which is entirely unrelated to accounting and fraud. But I decided I didn't want to do that for my career. And someone I happened to go to university with told me about forensic services and fraud and that sort of world, and said that's really good for scientists because you need that inquiring mind. It's a really important skill set. So decided to apply for the graduate scheme and was successful. I spent my first 3 years doing audit, which certainly wasn't where I wanted to spend my career, but was incredibly useful grounding, especially for someone who didn't study business or finance at that university. And then I moved over full time to our forensic services team. Again, really just through luck, worked on a number of investigations that were really about governance and leadership and where that had gone wrong. I really enjoyed that work. I think for me, it was working on cases that were quite high profile, working on things that, you know, people had heard about what I was doing in the news. I couldn't tell them about it, and there was something exciting about doing that as well, but I enjoyed that. And I liked the governance work in particular because you really got to understand how businesses were working, how the leadership was working, why they were making the decisions they were making, and on what evidence. So I built a bit of a specialism in that. And then as ESG became more and more important, and my firm started pulling together specialists, because I had the governance side, I was asked to upskill myself in the E and the S. And 3 years later, nearly, that's where I find myself now. Still very much learning, especially some of the more technical areas of the environmental and social legislation. You know, it's moving so quickly. There's just so much to learn, but really love it. And it's nice to work on something that feels like it's making a difference.
Thank you, Laura. Rebecca.
Yeah, so I've always had quite an analytical brain, and after I graduated, I was looking for kind of things in the intelligence cryptography space. My dissertation was on cryptography. I won't bore you on the actual title. So I was kind of looking in that intel space. I looked at the armed forces, but the fitness exams were way over my capability. I don't want to be doing any push-ups. But it looked to me like there were a few good options in government. So I actually started my career at the Fraud Investigation Service at HMRC, which was my gateway into kind of fraud investigations. And to this day, I still tell everyone that it's my favorite job ever. We described it as being professionally nosy. So after kind of initial knocks on properties, we'd build cases for court. We'd look at, okay, how are these people money laundering? Are they doing these things that we think they're doing, tax fraud that they're committing? Went to court a few times, and from that moment was absolutely hooked on kind of this area of work. From there, kind of moved over to the Passport Office and worked a bit with the Passport Office, a bit with the National Crime Agency on kind of people trafficking and that side of work, and the fraud on passports. So fraudulently obtained genuine passports was a big thing that we were looking into in the intel in that space. Unfortunately, when 2020 rolled around, the intel on people moving around dried up quite quickly. So I started looking for other things, and I actually ended up in the Government Centre of Counter-Fraud Expertise, which is now the Public Sector Fraud Authority, looking at more of the strategic side of fraud, which I wasn't sure was really my bag away from the investigations, but found it really, really interesting and really, really helped me get a broader understanding of the fraud landscape across government and kind of how we can put processes in place. So I did that for about 3 years, looking at how we implement the cross-government counter-fraud strategy. And then from there, thought, should probably stop telling government departments how to do these things and put my money where my mouth is. So about a year ago, came over to become the head of counter-fraud at Ofgem. And since then, I've just been learning a lot, like Laura said, about all of the different environmental and social legislation, the schemes that we have. They're all so different and aim to do different things. We have so many different investigations ongoing, and just kind of learning about that and how we can use our position where we are now to shape that wider policy and the new schemes that are coming in this space. So it all started from being a bit nosy and wanting to do intelligence, and then we've ended up here.
Thank you. Well, incredibly diverse paths, but both ended up in incredibly interesting areas. In terms of my own path, also not linear. So I started by studying languages at university, one of which was Russian, and I thought fraud and Russian probably sounded like they worked quite well together. So I thought I would explore the law and did a postgraduate diploma in law. I think I probably at that time did not think I would ever delve into the world of criminal law. I thought that was not the world for me, and was much more suited to chancery, trust fraud, and highfalutin civil frauds. But when I came across Peters and Peters and the work that they did, I realized that actually criminal fraud was very interesting in terms of the type of work, and very varied, and a bit like you, Rebecca, probably satisfied my curious mind and nosy ability to ask questions and look into things in more and more detail, and absolutely fell in love with the fraud space, just because it is so varied, so interesting, and you come across, you know, a variety of different industries, different issues. You know, every case is incredibly different. Every client is incredibly different, and every day is different. So, in terms of fraud, that was my entry into fraud. In terms of ESG, I think in the last 5 years, obviously frauds have been perpetrated much longer than that, but in the ESG space, I've seen really a development of frauds in this space, and very interested to see how those have developed and how those have been tackled by enforcement agencies, because like every fraud, it's challenging to keep up with the fraudsters, and I know that enforcement bodies and agencies do their very best, and so that's been very interesting to get closer and better involvement in. So that has been mine. In terms of for those who are considering a career in this area, do you either of you have tips for which organizations, memberships they should be considering to really further their careers in this space? Other than the Fraud Advisory Panel, which obviously...
Of course, yes. I was going to mention that one. I think one of the things I've found as I've moved into this space is there is just a huge volume of information, events, webcasts focused on ESG, but it's quite hard to find ones that are much narrower and focused specifically on eco-fraud, maybe come at things more from this sort of angle. So as well as Fraud Advisory Panel and organisations that have that very much that fraud focus, I think for me, the accounting bodies have been quite helpful in terms of putting out some of the training. Some of the webcasts that they've done have been really interesting. There is, on top of that, actually a lot of law firms are doing quite a lot of interesting webcasts that I find help to upskill on specific cases and some of those individual pieces of legislation and regulations that we've been talking about. From my perspective, I'm someone who tends to learn by doing. So whilst I've been on a number of different training courses that my firm have put me on, I have found those very helpful. Really, it's getting involved, getting stuck in, just building that experience where it's available to me. And I've found even when I've been doing cases of what you would look at and think, no, that's not really ESG fraud, eco fraud in any way, there's quite often an angle and something to consider if you're really thinking about it. So just building some of my experience that way has helped me just to get more confident in the space.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, the doing of an investigation really is getting thrown in the deep end is the best way to learn in this space. But I guess from when I started to now, there's a lot more training courses out there. I think even Portsmouth now do a master's in fraud and economic crime, which was definitely not available 10 years ago, and might even do it myself just for a bit of fun. But things like the accredited counter-fraud specialist, accredited counter-fraud technicians, things like those courses can really, really help in this space. I know a lot of government organisations trying to put people on that and looking for those sort of qualifications in this space if you're trying to get into that. As Laura said, there's a lot of different events that are happening. So there's a fraud prevention summit that I think people can go to. The public sector counter fraud conference happens every year, and I believe free for all public sector workers, but also if you work in the charity sector or the private sector, you can pay to go. And I think just immersing yourself in those environments and just talking to other people who work in this space can be really, really helpful, because until you speak to them, you might not think about how the fraud will evolve in that space. I mean, if you'd asked me 5 years ago what fraud happens at Ofgem, I'm not sure I would have been able to tell you. So just kind of like throwing yourself into those kind of wide scale networking things, I think is really helpful, and helps to broaden your mind of what is out there.
Really good piece of advice. Thank you. We've got a question from Louise Barton, specifically to Laura. I don't know if we can give, but Laura, the question is, could you give us more examples of fraud in the carbon credit space?
Yes. I can, if I give you the example I was thinking of, and I suppose I'll caveat this by saying this is probably one of those grey areas to an extent. So generally how carbon credits work is I suppose there's an accounting mechanism. So you're looking at, by taking whatever action it is, how much carbon are you going to save or prevent going into the environment? And people tend to think of them as trees being planted, but a lot of these schemes are actually preventing trees from being chopped down. And then if you think, well, how do you predict what trees were going to be chopped down and what's the change there? It's the same with certain types of stoves, for example. There are some schemes that relate to those. So there's one example it'd be worth reading up on if you're interested in. It relates to the Kariba Forest project in Zimbabwe. That was a project run by South Pole, which is one of the largest sellers of carbon credits. And I think it's interesting to read both sides of the story there and form a view yourself on who was right and who was wrong, and what could be done differently. I think South Pole will say that they accounted for those schemes using the appropriate methodology at the time. And one of the challenges is that was a long time ago and things have moved on, exactly as you said, Maria. So who's at fault now that methodologies have changed in the future? Those carbon credits were sold early on. And there's some useful analysis on Transparency International and on The Guardian that kind of brings it to light and talks through all of the different issues. But one of the key ones was actually, again, the impact on the local community and the fact that they weren't getting the benefit from those schemes that you might expect them to. But this is very much also about prevention of deforestation, which is just incredibly hard to measure. So yeah, quite a difficult one when you're looking for that intent and that explicitness that comes around fraud. These schemes are incredibly complex. They operate over a long period of time. There's lots of different factors, but it's a really interesting area of to look into more.
There are also a number of German cases that have been targeting the analysis of how you calculate the carbon credit and how that is evolving, and how actually even the regulatory bodies are understanding it has developed such that they won't just accept what would have previously been acceptable. So if you're interested in some of the kind of European cases as well, definitely worth looking at those, just in terms of their analysis of how the science has moved on. I'm conscious that I've left a few minutes for questions if there are more questions, just in case there are specifics, and then we can wrap up. Okay. I think we have dealt with Josh's question, and hopefully it wasn't a question, it was more of a comment, but a helpful one. Are there any other questions that people would like dealt with? And silence is permissible here. I mean, it's obviously very difficult to cover such a broad topic, but it's been very interesting to see different experiences and different views, because obviously we see it through our professional prism, which is, even though the terms and the frauds are the same, we're seeing it from a different angle, which is really helpful. So thank you both. And if we don't have any questions, I will draw this to a close. Thank you. It's been enlightening for me, actually, even if it hasn't for our participants, to understand the different angles. Oh, all right, we've had one where would you go for the gold standard for carbon credit? Well, Laura?
I think that's very much in question at
Yeah.
the moment. I'm not aware that there is one, but definitely not a scientist in this area, so couldn't say with certainty. But I know there's a lot of challenge around them.
Rebecca, do you have the answer?
Unfortunately not, I'm afraid. Not my area of expertise. I was hoping Laura did.
And that's just to say that it is evolving, and actually I don't think there is, in the ESG space, there is no gold standard, I think, for any of the kind of aspects of ESG, which is the difficulties for companies and for individuals, both from a consumer side and from a business side. So it is an interesting area to watch, and perhaps, Louise, if you find the answer, you can let us know. We'd be very interested to hear. But anyway, thank you everyone for joining today's session. Our next workshop and events will go up on the Fraud Advisory Panel website, and do message the Fraud Advisory Panel if you have any questions that flow from today's session. Obviously, if you're interested in getting involved in the FCFC, do get in touch. And we look forward to seeing you on our next session. And thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, Laura. It's been a great session to have with you both.
Thanks,
Maria.